And put that over there. All the little bits in all the little places. That's the joy of technology. A lot more button clicking, but it means there's much more that we can do. And that's a good thing. What? There we go. Okay. I am going to put in the caveat right now at the beginning that my internet connectivity is once again going through a period of, well, just it's barely working. So I'm hoping this is going to keep going. If it doesn't, I have now known from recent events, it probably will not come back in a timely manner, which means I'm going to give you all a dispensation right here from the beginning. If this feed cuts out, it means that the internet provider has decided that I will not be using the internet for another half hour. So go ahead and just quit if this feed stops. I will not be back to be able to continue. Hopefully, I'll be able to get it better by the time I have my Mishnah class tonight, but no promises. Bli neder, as we say, without making a vow, because this is something that is beyond my control and barely beyond my control to remain cool-headed about, because it's been going on far too much. But that being said, we use the time that we have to study. We use the time to be together. So let's go ahead and dive in and make the most of whatever my internet provider wants to give me for the next little bit. So we are in Parashat Mishpatim. And as we discussed last week, when I resumed the Torah class following my sabbatical, we are trying something a little different for a while at least, and I always welcome feedback. We are doing a reading with Rashi, here found on the right-hand side of the screen, and Rashbam, here found on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're going to go through these for two reasons. One, Rashi is simply the most famous and a widely accepted commentary on the Torah, although he is not exclusive, meaning that there are plenty of other commentators who disagree with him, including his grandson Rashbam on many points, and some are simply trying to add additional information. Two, the types of courses I've done mostly on our Parashah class have been very in-depth on small selections of the Torah, and I would like to cover more ground and get a broader, straightforward understanding of the Torah in order to fill in some of the gaps that may have been left because of my focus on small portions over the year. With that in mind, I want to get as much actual study in as we can before the internet goes, and just because that's partly the point of this reframing of the class. So let's dive in. We are in Parashat Mishpatim, here in chapter 21 of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, following on from Aseret HaDibrot, from the Ten Commandments of last week's Parasha of Yitro, though we didn't get to study that in person. So these are the rules that you shall set before them. And immediately, although you may feel that that is as straightforward as it can possibly be, we have two very important commentaries. One from Rashi, and then also from Rashbam. I would actually like to start off with Rashbam, because he is, in this comment, I think, going to present a very interesting concept that we need to bear in mind. Everyone endowed with intelligence, which is the diplomatic way of saying, unless you're stupid, should know that it is not my purpose to explain halakhic rulings as part of my commentary, something I have mentioned already in my commentary at the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev. So he's trying to make it clear to us that in case we didn't notice it earlier, and we didn't study it, so definitely I wanted to bring this to your attention, that his commentary is not meant to be a commentary on Jewish practice. He is not interpreting the Torah so that we can better observe the Torah. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I thought you said we were going to read the Torah in a straightforward fashion. Doesn't that include how you would apply the Torah in life, how you would actually follow the mitzvot? Yes and no. As we have discussed in many of our previous classes, the understanding of how to apply the Torah, the actual halacha l'maaseh of what do we do for this mitzvah in our day at this time, is the cumulative effect of the rabbinic understanding, going back to the oral tradition from when Torah was given, all the way through the different decisions and rulings and commentary that was given from that point forward. As such, the Torah itself, and this is going to sound radical to some of you, is inadequate by itself to understand what we should do in order to actually abide by the Torah. All right, let me make sure that that gets passed on again, because I know this is quite contrary to the understandings of many. Some Jews, some just from the general culture that have absorbed many of the more controversial opinions of the Protestant Reformation. The text of the Torah itself, by itself, would be inadequate to understand how to actually live a Torah life. And that means that we need additional context, understanding, and study. That's why we have Mishnah and Talmud. It's why we have the legal codes. It's why we have the commentaries on all of those things. And why, of course, we have the psak halacha, the decisions of halacha, that are the actual rules that we follow. What Rashbam is trying to draw our attention to here is that his commentary is not coming to give us all that information. We have the Talmud, we have the other legal codes, we have the other commentaries of legal matters. He's not trying to speak to that topic. That topic is well covered. Excuse me, indeed, that topic was very well covered prior to the introduction around the time of Rashi to have a consistent verse-by-verse commentary. And really what Rashbam and Rashi are doing is filling in the greater need of understanding the Torah by itself within its own straightforward context, the Peshat, as we've discussed. So he goes on to explain. I explained that there are many such rulings that I explained there, in Parashat Vayeshev, that many such rulings are hinted at by variant spellings in the text, missing words, or extraneous words, something that I've drawn your attention to over the years. Many of these have been covered in the commentary on the Torah by my grandfather Rashi of blessed memory. I have set myself the task of only explaining the plain meaning, the straightforward meaning of the text as it is before us, meaning this section of the Torah right here, what is the most straightforward way to understand it? When I explain legislation, I do so within the context of its contribution to derech eretz, civilized behavior. My explanations notwithstanding, when they conflict with halakhic rulings, the latter are supreme. Okay, incredibly important commentary here that deserves an entire class all on its own. But the upshot of what Rashbam is trying to get across to us is that it is possible to generate a commentary to the Torah that seems to be matching the straightforward meaning of the Torah in its own context, in that particular paragraph or chapter, that does not seem to be obviously informing Jewish practice on that same topic. And that is because there is a gap between what the Torah seems to be saying on its own in a straightforward way and how it has been applied, understood, and studied over the thousands of years that come to Rashbam time, and then an additional 1,000 years to our own time. And we need to be cognizant of that. Rashbam is essentially trying to interpret Torah with one hand behind his back, of saying, what does it seem to mean just if you were reading it without the insight of everything that was shared orally and decided over the centuries? And he wants to make sure that we understand that does not mean that that straightforward understanding is better. Quite the contrary, the understanding that comes down through Jewish law, through the chain of halakha, is the one we need to hold on to when it comes to Jewish practice. Someone who says they are going to follow the Torah by itself is wrong, or at least not Jewish. They are not following Jewish practice in that circumstance. The Torah needs commentary, discussion, and the accumulation of decisions and precedents in order for it to be a living, breathing document that is actually usable to a community. One person can read it and come up with whatever ideas they want. That can be interesting. One person can read it and give us insights from the text and the language of the Torah itself, showing the seeds of what will be the growth of Jewish law and understanding. That's what Rashbam's doing. But Just because it seems to be implying one thing in the Torah text itself doesn't mean that's how we live and rule on those same topics in our own day, or in Rashbam's day, or in the days of the Mishnah or the Talmud. Okay, so with that in mind, these rules, he is giving us a heads up as he gives the commentary on them. Some of his commentary is going to be absolutely opposed to Jewish law as we understand it. So buckle in. Let's go over and see what his grandfather had to say on this, which was a very different feel. Now, these are the judgments, and he's focusing here on the word ve'ele. Wherever these is used, it cuts off the preceding section from that which it introduces. Where, however, ve'ele and these, with the inclusion of the vav, is used, it adds something to the former. That is to say, it forms a continuation of it. So also here. And these, the text that we have in Mishpatim, are the judgments, the mishpat, the rules. What is the case with the former commandments? Meaning to say the 10 commandments that, like I mentioned, that we just finished in the last chapter, they were given at Sinai. So too, these were given at Sinai. So this is a continuation. When we say ve'ele hamishpatim, we are not introducing a whole new section of law that has its own status. This is a continuation of the theophany of the exposition of the commandments by God at Mount Sinai. And then he gives the citations for that. If this be so, why is this section dealing with the civil laws placed immediately after the commanding the making of the altar? Because there is a small digression, if you will, between the end of the 10 commandments and the beginning of Mishpatim here in 21. And that deals with the building of the ramp and the altar that was used. To tell you that you should seat, that is to say, provide quarters for the Sanhedrin in the vicinity of the temple. So that digression is not a digression, it is a contextualization, says Rashi, that the rules that we are talking about is not a separate element of society, that it, together with the so-called ritual aspects of the temple and the sacrificial services, those need to be juxtaposed, meaning the temple ritual sacrifices need to be offered in the same place where the ultimate adjudication, the Sanhedrin, the highest court, will be held. And that will provide a holistic understanding of what our relationship is to God. The rules of the temple, the rules of the altar, are not a separate, better or worse service of God from the rules that govern our society. All right, but Rashi also has more to say on this very simple verse, which you shall put before them. God said to Moses, it should not enter your mind to say, I will teach them a section of the Torah or a single halakha twice or three times until it will become current in their mouths exactly according to its wording. That is to say, until they know it the text verbatim, but I shall not take the trouble to make them understand the reason of each thing and its significance. That is not what we should say. As I've talked about in many other classes, the Midrash often deals with sort of this proving a positive by disproving a negative. You shouldn't think, don't believe, you might have thought, all of things which are meant to be disproved in order to understand the contrary. So God saying, we did not get the Torah just so we could memorize it, and Moses was not tasked with giving us the Torah just so he could force us to memorize it by rote. Instead, the Torah was given not only so that we should learn it by its actual words, but that we should also understand those words and their meaning. Therefore, Scripture says, which you shall set before them, meaning more literally, like we see from Genesis 34, like a table fully laid before a person with everything ready for eating. Not just the raw ingredients of the Torah, meaning the literal words in and of themselves, but each word explained, understood, and laid out so that indeed the Torah will be fit for consumption for the rest of us. It is not just about having a document that we can recite by heart, but one that actually enters our heart with meaning and understanding so that we can live by it. Okay, two very important commentaries, and I wanted to make sure we give them enough time, and so far the internet's holding out. Great. Let's go ahead and finish off Rashi's commentary here on verse 1. Again, we are focusing now on the lifnehem, the before them aspect of that verse, but not before the heathens, meaning to say those that are not Jewish. It's unfortunate that the term heathen or even goy has a very negative connotation in the modern world. It is here used simply as taxonomy. There are Jews and there are non-Jews. There is no statement of derision necessarily about a non-Jewish person in that term. It'll depend upon what they are described as doing in any given context. Even if you know that in the case of a particular matter of law, they will decide it in the same way as Jewish law would, do not bring it before their courts. For he who brings Israel law cases before the heathens defames the names of the Lord and pays honor to the name of the idol. That is to say, the idol in the name of which the heathen court administers justice, idolatry, of course, being the default throughout most of history, thereby giving it undue importance. As it is said, Deuteronomy, for their rock is not as our rock, that our enemies should be judges over us. Which implies when our enemies are judges over us, that is to say, if we make them judges over us, it is a testimony to the superiority of that which they revere, meaning their idol. This is not talking necessarily about civil law and legislation as we know it, for even in the days of Rashi, such things were simply unheard of. All law systems were based within a religious tradition of the community. And Rashi is pointing out in the words taken from the Midrash and from our sages of old that we have to be very reluctant in idolatrous communities of appealing to their courts on any given issues. We should always seek a Jewish ruling rather than one from an idolatrous court. And even if we believe that the idolatrous court has the exact same rule and they would adjudicate exactly as a Jewish court would, we should still avoid giving it any respect or authority over us beyond that which they demand, usually under the threats and intimidation. But we should certainly not willingly submit ourselves to their courts, which are done in the honor of their idols and foreign religious strictures, often with the intent, of course, of removing Judaism as a viable form of life. Okay. One verse down, let's keep going. Now we get to the nitty-gritty of Mishpatim. It's many different topics, which we will not get to, but we're starting off with the concept of slavery. Let me move that over. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. Let's take a look at what that means, because there's a lot of misunderstandings that can happen about the concept of slavery in Judaism. And this is something that can, hopefully clear up a little bit, but I'm sure that it will also create a little bit of discomfort, as we have thankfully inherited 2,000 plus years of Jewish teaching, which has moved us away from seeing any form of slavery or indentured servitude as being possible. But we must understand it both in context as well as how it has been understood since. Again, starting with Rashbam on the left, the Torah speaks about a Jewish thief who did not have enough money to make restitution. You can see from Exodus 22, further on in the same Torah portion, if he is unable to make restitution, he will be sold in settlement for what he stole. So these 6 years then that he is working, this applies to the thief who was sold by the court. That is one category of a Jewish slave or a Hebrew slave or indentured servant, however you wish to define the Eved in this context. The case of someone who had to sell himself, meaning his labor, is discussed by the Torah in Leviticus 25. Under the heading, when your brother has fallen on economically hard times, so that he had to sell himself to cover his debts. So Rashbam is pointing out that there is another concept of a Hebrew slave, where somebody has become so impoverished by the horrible circumstances of their life that they are unable to provide for themselves or their family in many cases at all, and they sell themselves. And here the translator has made it sound like just his labor, and indeed that puts a little bit of the ambiguity on the nature of this relationship. But the person really is selling themselves in advance and relinquishing a lot of their freedom in order that someone else will take care of them due to their financial trouble. Concerning that situation, the Torah adds that he goes free in the Jubilee year. In our situation, the term he is sold for is 6 years. Some of our sages hold that both situations are halachically similar based on a gezerah shava, that is to say, identical wording being used by the Torah in both examples. That is to say, the word in question being the unnecessary word of ya'avor, of working and laboring at that time. Again, Rashbam is not going to give us all of the legal implications of this because that's not the point of his discussion and debate, but he is trying to tell us that here, when we're talking about a Hebrew slave, knowing the rest of the Torah, we have to understand that this is being contextualized in this location just with regards to somebody who has been sold in order to pay off a debt incurred because they had acted as a thief. He goes on to discuss the rest of this verse, the 7th year after he was sold, not the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle. So he is arguing that in context, the straightforward meaning would be that this 7th year release for this thief slave would be the 7 years after his capture and punishment began, or really indebtedness began, and that this is not, in his opinion, in context, referring to the sabbatical cycle. And then he finishes off with the word lechofshi, when he leaves without payment, is how it's translated, that this is a participle of a verb meaning without having to pay compensation. So had the word described the state of liberty of the servant now released, the word would have been vocalized, well, differently. Rather than lach, it would have been lech. So you don't need to go into the grammar, but he is trying to say that the without payment here means without payment from the thief slave to the person who purchased his labor from the court. That this is not about what would have been paid to him, and it's not talking about him going to freedom, that this is just talking about the idea that there will not be any additional compensation required from the thief slave at the end of his 7-year term. Over in Rashi's interpretation, we'll see that he has a different focus on his understanding. If you buy a Hebrew slave, this means a servant who is Hebrew, obviously Ivri, or perhaps this is not so. Again, typical midrashic fashion. Let's talk about the counter and see whether or not we can be confident one way or the other. Or perhaps this is not so, but it means a servant of a Hebrew. That is to say, one who has been the servant of a Hebrew. For example, a Canaanite servant whom you bought from an Israelite, and it is with regards to him that the scripture says 6 years shall he serve. Okay, so the problem here is that the phrase Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, could mean a slave that is Hebrew, or it could mean a slave that belongs to a Hebrew. The basic grammar of just those two words is ambiguous, and it could go in either direction. So how do we figure it out? And if you ask that, how will I then explain the commandment from Leviticus 25, and you shall leave them, meaning the Canaanite servants, as an inheritance for your children, and they shall serve you forever, right? You can't go down that line because Exodus 25 seems to contradict it by implying that a Canaanite slave would serve in perpetuity. Then I reply that this refers to the case of a Canaanite servant who has been bought from a heathen, from a non-Jew. But if such a servant had been bought from an Israelite, he should go free at the end of 6 years. So he's pointing out there is a logical way to understand even the seemingly contradictory verse of Leviticus 25. However, this explanation that our text refers to a Canaanite servant will not hold. So up till here, he was willing to entertain that logic, and now he's saying, actually, that doesn't work. For scripture states, Deuteronomy 15, and if your brother, a Hebrew man, be sold to you to serve you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free. The Torah says, as it were, by using the term achicha and ha'ivri, your brother and the Hebrew, I tell you this, that the servant shall go free in the 7th year only with regards to your brother. Consequently, Exodus 25 has to be applied to any Canaanite servant, whether bought from a Hebrew or from a non-Jew, and Eved Ivri in our text can only denote an Eved that is actually also a Hebrew, not merely one that is serving somebody that is Hebrew. So it's nice to have Rashi walk us through these different interpretations. These are ones that Rashbam were sort of assuming seem to be straightforward enough, but as you can see, our tradition wanted more justification for this interpretation, since the phrase Eved Ivri was not 100% clear just by itself. Continuing on this verse, if you buy a Hebrew servant, this means a Hebrew servant whom you have bought from the hand of the court, which sold him for a theft which he had committed, like Rashbam explained from Exodus 22. If he, the thief, have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. Or, again, finding the contrary, perhaps this is not so, but Scripture is referring to the case of one who sells himself as a servant on account of his destitution, while he who has been sold by the court for his theft shall not go free at the end of 6 years. So maybe the thief's term of service is open-ended, and it is only the indentured person that goes free at the end of 6 years. This assumption is erroneous. For when Scripture states, Leviticus 25, and if your brother that dwells with you becomes poor, and he shall sell himself to you, he shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. It is plain in this passage, this passage there is mentioned the case of one who sells himself on account of destitution. How then must I explain this person here who has been sold? Obviously referring to him who was sold by the court. And we don't need to go on to his last commentary because that's more of a grammatical issue, which we can talk about at another time if you're that interested. Okay, so as we can see, similar but still significantly different interpretations and a different tact of approaching the interpretations. As you can see, Rashbam is more likely to try and answer the questions from the verses of the Torah itself to the best of his ability, maybe referencing some of the rabbinic understanding, but trying to really stick to the text in and of itself as much as possible. Rashi is not so fettered and is more interested in making sure that the people understand the general understanding, or at least the maybe predominant understanding of a particular text that has been adopted over the years. 21:3. If a male slave came single, and we know that it's a male slave partly because of the pronoun that's being used here, and even if it was meant to be an indefinite pronoun that could be of any gender, we have different rules, as we'll see, when it comes to a woman. If a male slave came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. We'll get to the rest of this discussion in just a second, but I want to try and keep up with the commentary as we go. We're going to go over again to Rashbam first, as he has a shorter insight to bring for this, and Rashi will take more explanation. The Torah first mentions the subject in general terms, then proceeds to the details. For instance, if the servant was unmarried at the time the court sold him, or even if his master has given him a wife while he was in his employ, he leaves without his wife, seeing that the woman given to him as a wife remains in the house of the master, her employer. Having said this, the Torah continues to explain how this works. If he was already married, his wife, who will also be in charge on his master, will leave with him when he is relieved from his involuntary contract after 6 years. However, if his master had provided him with a wife during the period of his forced employ, the wife in question remains with her master. The wife the master had assigned to his Jewish servant was a Gentile servant maid whose body belongs to her master, meaning that she was of a different status of property within the ancient understanding of slavery. There are still limits and rules on how a slave, even a Canaanite slave, can be treated, but we'll follow the commentary as we go rather than trying to be comprehensive. As always, there's more to always be said about every verse, and we're just doing the best we can with where we are in the text today. Rashi will give us a little bit more of some of that information. If he came in by himself, This means that he was unmarried, as the Targum, as the translation into Aramaic renders it, if he came in alone. The term by himself, in this sense, bigap po, is the same as saying that it came in under the wing or the skirt. He came in only just as he was, alone, merely wrapped in his garment, so that in his clothing basically means in the skirt of his garment, meaning that he came in completely with nothing, had nothing when he walked through the door. And in such case, he shall go out by himself. This intimates that if he was unmarried originally when he came in, his master is not allowed to give him against his will a Canaanite handmaid with the object of raising slaves. Now, that's where Rashi is bringing in here from the Talmud the understanding of the sages that Rashbam left out. Rashbam is implying within the context of the Torah itself that we don't know exactly what role the Hebrew slave plays in the decision about having this additional wife being given to him. Rashi points out that under Jewish law, and the way the rabbis understood this from the oral tradition and then its application, is that the Hebrew slave would have the right to say, I don't want to take on this wife that you are trying to provide for me. Either I don't like her or I don't want to have children with her that will remain the property of the man that I am now serving, as they will not be considered Hebrews, they will not be considered Jews. So we see an element of choice that goes into this that might otherwise have been missed without rabbinic interpretation. If he be married, well, that has to mean then to an Israelite woman. Then his wife shall go out with him. But who brought her in the first place into the state of service that the text has to state she shall go out? So Rashi's trying to point out, why was she even with him at all? If he was the one who committed the theft, if he is the one that was sold into this indentured servitude, why is she with him and why is she going free? Well, but by saying this, scripture intimates that he who acquires a Hebrew servant is bound to provide his wife and children also with food. That if you were to hire this slave thief, this thief slave, the slave who was sold into slavery because of his theft, that you do not only have to provide for him, because you can't just starve him to death, but you also have to provide for his family, that they should not be left destitute and free to die just because of his crime, but you need to take care of them as well. And then Rashi continues in 21:4, if his Lord has given him a wife, from this we learn that if he already had an Israelite wife, the master has the right to give him a Canaanitish handmaid with the object of raising slaves. We already discussed a little bit before. Or perhaps this is not so, but scripture by Isha, this word for wife, is speaking about an Israelite woman, meaning this the man is arranging for an Israelite woman to be a wife to the slave in his employ. Scripture, however, states that the wife and her children shall be the master's. Consequently, the text can only be speaking of a Canaanite woman, for a Hebrew maidservant goes free at the end of 6 years, just as a Hebrew manservant does. Yes, even before the termination of 6 years, she goes free if she shows symptoms of incipient puberty. For it is said in Deuteronomy 15, and if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. Which statement teaches you that a Hebrew woman also goes free after 6 years of service. So one of the important things of using the commentary brings for us is the ability to use other aspects of the Torah to help us understand the current verse that we are discussing. And here, drawing from Deuteronomy 15, we see that a Hebrew woman would be set free exactly the same way. A few caveats as we're going to get that give more leniency in her case, but at this point in the same way. And thus, we have to understand that the wife that is being provided here is not a Jewish woman, not an Israelite woman, but must instead be a non-Jewish. Which leads us into verse 5, where the slave gets to make a declaration. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free. In such a case, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or to the doorpost of his master, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain his master's slave for life. So as Rashi points out, which should already be clear, this wife that he says he loves, this has to be the Canaanite handmaid that he was given. This cannot be a Jewish wife because she would be going free regardless, and there's no reason why he would then be staying to be with her or their children. They could leave as a unit as well. Now, what do we mean by his master shall take him before God and that he shall be brought to the doorpost and all